How was your time in the classroom? Because you say you initially was like, okay, I'm gonna retire from this girl. And
Hmm.
I'm gonna tell you, look, that's the opposite of me. Because my first year, when
Uh-huh.
I saw my first paycheck, I'm not gonna hold y'all. I saw that first paycheck and I was like, oh yeah, no, this can't be life. Because I worked way too hard for this. This is
Okay,
crazy.
yes.
Yes, I was like,
So,
oh, y'all probably get like 5 years out of me at
oh
most. And
wow.
I did longer, but
Wow.
I was just like, yeah, no, this ain't gonna be it.
Afterlife. So for
Yes.
me, ultimately, like I said, my narrative, when I look back and reflect on my journey, I was like, yeah, this was for me. Because if someone else had this narrative, they would have been like, I'm done.
Mhm.
When I prior to me graduating, I actually had, internship. So my teacher at the time, she was getting ready to retire. And ultimately, she said, I can't retire. And I'm talking to her like, why can't you retire? What do you mean? When it's time to retire, you retire. What's
Right.
non-negotiable? And she said, she said, well, ultimately, I haven't found the person. This was when I first started and just having dialogue, just getting to know who she was. And she was like, I haven't found the right person. So that's why I'm ultimately still here. And I said, well, when do you have to have a person in place? She said, by May. I need to know who's going to be in this spot because at the end of the day, I want to make sure my students are taken care of. And I said,
Hmm.
oh, okay, all right. So fast forward, May hits or April hits, the last week in April, right before spring break. And she's like, she said, I have some news for you. And I said, well, what news do you have? She said, I found someone. And I said, okay, good. You found someone. So you're retiring. She's like, yes, I'm going to retire. And I said, okay, all right. And she said, I want you to, on Monday, when we follow from the spring break, you're going to come in and I want you to have a conversation with the principal for me. And I'm like, for what? Am I in trouble? What did I do? She was like, no. She said, the person that I'm speaking of is you.
Oh.
And I said, are you serious? She said, yeah. She said, this is where you need to be. So I said, are you sure? I said, this was an advanced class. I'm like, normally first year teachers, you don't get advanced classes. Like, how is this going to work? What
Mhm.
is this going to look like? She said, don't worry about it. She said, you're sold. It's done. So once that took place, I was like, okay, came back Monday. The principal, she was sitting on the left, principal was in front of me, and he was like, oh, she said she's ready to retire and the spot is all yours. I said, wait, there's no conversation. We're not going to talk. He's like, he was
We're
like, no.
talking. Like, this
He
is
said, we're
it.
talking. This is it. And I said, are you sure? I said, but advance, as a first year, he said, I trust her. I trust
No.
her, and therefore I'm trusting you on your actual journey. And he said, you're going to do great things. And I was like, okay, all right. So the first year, yeah, we did it. I came, conquered, did what I need to do. And then I was like, okay, this is it. I said, I thought I was going to teach high school. I
Mhm.
said it was middle school. And I said I was already offered a position for high school as well, and I just took the middle school position. I said, "What did I sign myself up for?" Fast forward 14 years in the classroom. That experience was wonderful. I won Teacher of the Year for the district, and then I said, ultimately, or my one non-negotiable was looping with my class. And anytime that I said, if I have to loop with my class, that means it's time for me to shift and leave.
What's the
So
looping? What's that?
looping where ultimately you get the same kids, just a different grade. So
Okay.
I had them seventh grade and they wanted me to loop with them eighth grade because the saying was I was the only gifted teacher. And I said, no,
Okay.
no, no, we're not doing that just because no, you need to get someone in place. That has nothing to do with me. And they said they didn't want to risk losing their scores. And I was like,
Mm.
no, but you're hindering me because I set them the foundation for them. And I told them, you're going to have a different teacher. That's always how I end out the year. I'm preparing you for the next person, not me again,
Hmm.
unless I got you halfway through the year. That's the only way that I will stick with you. But I've had you all year, non negotiable. What are we going to do? So after I won, I went to my principal and I talked to him. I said, look, he said, I already know. He said, I already know what you're doing. He said, you were the only teacher for gifted. And he said, that's no excuse. No. So I'm like, okay, everything that I was already going to say, you already know I love you dearly. So what are we doing? So he said, how can I make this better?
Mm,
I said, okay, how we're going to make this better. I want to go to Georgia.
mm,
He said, you want to go to Georgia? I said, yes, I want to go 2 weeks or 1 week. Let me go 1 week to Georgia. And he said, okay. Now, this is unheard of. When I tell this story to teachers, they're like, your principal lets you leave at the beginning of the year, August, to go to a different state to test out the waters to see if you wanted to be there. And I said, yes, he did. I thought this was the norm. This is what people do. And they said,
So you
no,
went to a different school
I went to a different
in
state.
Georgia?
I went to a different look from Florida. I'm originally was
Yes.
teaching here, and I went to Georgia to test out the waters. And he was like, yeah, you can go ahead and test it out and see, if this is something that you want to do. So I went to Georgia. Upon going to Georgia, I had an interview. I had an interview at one school and I fell in love with the school. And I said, okay, all right. On Friday, I have to call my principal and let him know. Talked to the principal in Georgia and I told him what the situation was. And he said, your principal is going to be okay with this. I said, I have to find a
No.
solution. I said,
Oh,
wait,
no, he's
what?
not.
No, he's not. I said, he's not. I have to quick fast and think of a solution real quick. He said, I got one. He said, I have a teacher here that same credentials as you. He said, the only thing, she's the dance teacher. She's cheerleading. I said, yeah, that wasn't my ministry. That wasn't what I was doing. So I said, ooh, I said, they want that. I said, let me talk to her. Let me have a conversation with her. So I called her on the phone and I talked to her and I said, hey, what's your MO? Let's talk. Come to find out, she was a friend of a friend here in Florida. And so
Oh,
I got checked her out as far as references, all that. And I said, yeah, she's a perfect fit. Yeah, we're two peas in a pod. So when I
nice.
called him on that Friday and I explained to him, I said, I made the decision. He said, you're staying in Georgia. I said, well,
Mm.
yeah. I said, I'll finish. I said, to be fair, I'll finish. I said, I have something for you. He said, what do you have? I said, I have a teacher that is gifted and all the credentials that I have and then some. I said, I want you to have a conversation with her. She has to come back down to Florida. She has to come back down to Florida. And he said, are you serious? I said, yes. And he said, okay, put me on the line with her. He hired her. And
Wow.
he was like, wow. He said, this has never happened. I said, so we just flip flopped. I went to
So she
Georgia. She
came from
came here.
yeah. Oh, wow. That's
So she
nice.
came and I took on her class because she was like, okay, I can't leave because these are my kids. I don't know. But she had to. She had to come back, relocate to Florida. And it was like unheard of
Look at that
because he was
alignment,
like,
though. That's
yeah,
amazing.
he was like, I've never had this. So the last thing that he said to me was, if you ever come back down to Florida and you move back, he said, he said, you will always know where I am, what school, where I'm at, and you will always have a job. And I
No.
was like, wow. And I said, everyone's like, okay, you have bad blood. I said, no, he had a conversation with the principal in Georgia and they were on the same page and they were laughing and I was hired. I started working in Georgia in October 2012. So that
No.
was 3 months into the school year. And mind you, that group of scholars or students that I had, it was rough because coming from Florida, the school that I taught at, it was, they had all the bells and whistles.
Mm.
And then when I got to Georgia, it was like, okay, we don't have all the bells and whistles. They have limitations. What is going on? I said, you know what? We're gonna make it do what it do. And on top of that, many of the students they were on house arrest. And I was like, wait
Mm.
a minute, this is middle school. What are we doing? I'm
Right.
not used to this. So the first conversation that I had with the student was, we're gonna see how long you last. I said, what, how long you last? What do you mean? He said, okay, well, the previous individuals, they were here in August. He said, you don't realize it's October. They
Mm.
left. We ran them out. And I was like, and that's something you want to be proud of? And they said, yeah, I came in my Sunday best because that's what I knew. And they're like, yeah, you come in your Sunday best. We're going to watch you leave. I was like, no, 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 no. I'm from Florida. We don't leave. We don't
What?
do that. So ultimately, I instilled in them, some character, like some things that were
Yes.
non-negotiable. This